Montana Territory, 1873. The distant crack of thunder rolled across the empty plains as Thomas Yates stared at the weathered grave marker. Wind whipped his light brown hair, forcing him to clamp down on his Stetson. At 25, he had already seen enough death to last several lifetimes, first as a Union soldier, then as a ranch hand caught in a cattle war that wasn't his fight. The crude wooden cross bore just a name and date: Jacob Winters, 1872, his friend, his brother in all ways but blood, dead because Thomas had trusted the wrong people. "This is it, Jake," Thomas said, his voice barely audible above the prairie wind. "Fresh start, like we always talked about." He adjusted his worn saddlebags across his shoulder and turned toward his dun-colored horse. The gelding stood patiently, having grown accustomed to these one-sided conversations at dusty gravesites. Thomas ran a hand along his clean-shaven jaw, feeling the tension in his muscles. He'd spent the winter working odd jobs in Denver, saving every penny for this moment, enough money to stake a small claim somewhere far from Colorado's blood-soaked plains, somewhere a man could build something without looking over his shoulder. No more trusting folks, no more getting involved, just me and the land. He mounted his horse with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. The frontier's no place for getting attached. Learned that lesson the hard way. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as Thomas rode north. Rain would come soon, washing away his tracks, fitting for a man trying to erase his past. 2 weeks later, the small settlement of Cottonwood Creek appeared before him like a mirage in the Montana wilderness. Thomas had pushed hard, avoiding other travelers, sleeping under the stars rather than in the occasional roadhouses. The less people remembered his face, the better. The town wasn't much: a general store, saloon, small church, blacksmith, and a scattering of homes and businesses stretched along a single dusty street. But it was far from Colorado, and that's what mattered. Thomas reined in at the hitching post outside the general store, his boots raising small clouds of dust as he dismounted. His entire body ached from weeks in the saddle, and his supplies had dwindled to nearly nothing. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and Thomas instinctively cataloged his surroundings: 2 customers examining fabric, an older man behind the counter, and a young woman sorting items onto a shelf. Old habits from dangerous times. "Afternoon," the shopkeeper called. "New in town?" Thomas nodded curtly. "Just passing through. Need supplies." He kept his responses brief, his manner distant, getting friendly only invited questions. "Well, you've come to the right place. Jasper Henley, at your service." The shopkeeper extended his hand. Thomas hesitated before shaking it. "Thomas Yates." "What brings you to our little corner of Montana, Mr. Yates?" Before Thomas could formulate a suitably vague response, a crash came from the back of the store, followed by a woman's startled cry. Without thinking, he moved toward the sound, rounding a tall shelf to find the young woman he'd noticed earlier surrounded by spilled flour, a broken crate at her feet. "Oh goodness!" She looked up, her face flushed with embarrassment. Thomas froze. She was perhaps 21 or 22, with dark chestnut hair pinned loosely beneath a practical bonnet. Her blue calico dress was simple but well-made, dusted now with white flour, but it was her eyes that caught him, warm brown, expressive, and currently mortified. "Let me help," he found himself saying, contrary to every rule he'd set for himself about keeping distance from strangers. "You'll get your clothes all dirty," she protested, but Thomas was already kneeling to gather the larger pieces of broken crate. "Katherine Baker," Jasper called from the front. "What happened now, girl?" "The bottom gave way on that old flour crate, Uncle Jasper," she called back, brushing flour from her skirt. "I told you it was rotting through." She turned to Thomas and offered a smile that seemed to brighten the dim corner of the store. "Thank you, Mr. Yates." Thomas Yates. He found himself returning her smile with a small one of his own, an unfamiliar sensation after so many months of grim determination. "Katherine Baker." "Everyone calls me Kate." She brushed a strand of hair from her face, leaving a smudge of flour on her cheek. "You're new here." It wasn't a question. In a town this size, any stranger would be noticed immediately. "Just arrived," he confirmed, helping her salvage what flour they could, planning to find some land to work. The word surprised him. He'd meant to say he was passing through, keeping to his plan of revealing as little as possible. Something about her direct gaze made lying seem pointless. Well, Mr. Yates, Cottonwood Creek is a fine place for new beginnings. She studied him with unexpected perceptiveness. Though you look like you could use a proper meal before you start building an empire. Thomas realized how he must appear after weeks on the trail-worn, dusty, and likely too thin from rationing his provisions. Mrs. Miller runs a respectable boarding house just down the street, Kate continued. Clean beds, hot food, and she doesn't ask too many questions of her guests. The slight emphasis on her last words told Thomas she'd sensed his desire for privacy. Much obliged for the recommendation, he said, surprised by the genuine warmth in his voice. As Thomas finished his purchases and led his horse toward the boarding house, he found himself thinking of Katherine Baker's smile. He quickly pushed the thought away. He'd come to Montana to start fresh, to build something tangible on his own. Getting distracted by a pretty face was exactly the kind of attachment that led to vulnerability. The frontier had taught him a harsh lesson: trust made you weak, and weakness got you killed. Mrs. Miller's boarding house proved exactly as advertised: clean, quiet, with generous portions of simple but hearty food. Thomas secured a room for a week, enough time to ask about available land and get his bearings. After the best meal and night's sleep he'd had in months, Thomas headed to the town's small land office the following morning. The agent, a bespectacled man named Porter, spread a map across his desk. Got several parcels available north of town, Porter explained, pointing to various markings. Good water, decent soil. This one here's got a small cabin already built, though it needs work. Thomas studied the map carefully. Previous owner. Fellow named Harrison, tried ranching for 2 years, then got word his mother was ailing back east. Sold cheap to fund his journey home. Porter adjusted his spectacles. 80 acres, with water rights to the creek that cuts through the northern corner. The price was fair, less than Thomas had expected to pay. The presence of even a rough cabin meant shelter while he built something more substantial. "I'll take it," he said, counting out the required funds. An hour later, Thomas emerged from the land office with the deed to his own piece of Montana. For the first time since Jake's death, he felt the weight on his shoulders lighten slightly. Here, far from Colorado's memories, he could build something that belonged only to him. As he crossed the street toward the general store to purchase supplies, he nearly collided with Katherine Baker, carrying a basket of goods. "Mr. Yates," her smile was as warm as the day before. "I see you took my advice about Mrs. Miller's." Thomas nodded, touching the brim of his hat. Good advice it was. "And have you found your empire yet?" There was a teasing quality to her voice that should have made him retreat into caution. Instead, he found himself responding to her easy manner. "Just purchased the old Harrison place north of town." Oh, her expression brightened further. "That's just past my uncle's property. We're practically neighbors." Before Thomas could process this information, a commotion down the street caught their attention. A wagon had arrived, the driver calling out for assistance. "Doctor, need the doctor. Got a man badly injured." Without thinking, Thomas strode toward the wagon, Kate close behind. Inside lay a man with a blood-soaked bandage around his thigh, his face gray with pain. "Mining accident," the driver explained to the gathering crowd. "Tunnel collapse at the Cowboy Creek operation." Dr. Wilson, a gray-haired man with a perpetually worried expression, appeared from his office. "Get him inside." Thomas helped carry the injured miner into the doctor's office, the man groaning with each movement. The wound was serious, the doctor's grimace confirmed it. "I need assistance," Dr. Wilson said, looking around the room. His gaze settled on Thomas. "You have steady hands, young man." Thomas hesitated only briefly before nodding. He'd seen worse during the war, had learned basic field medicine out of necessity. "Katherine, fetch my instruments from the cabinet," the doctor instructed. "The rest of you wait outside." For the next hour, Thomas assisted as Dr. Wilson worked to save the miner's leg, handing instruments, holding the man steady, and finally helping to stitch the wound. Katherine remained too, providing water, clean cloths, and calm reassurance to the patient. When the worst was over, the three of them stepped outside, exhausted but relieved. The miner would recover, though he'd walk with a limp. "Thank you both," Dr. Wilson said. "I couldn't have managed alone." Thomas nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with the doctor's gratitude and the admiring look in Katherine's eyes. He hadn't come to Cottonwood Creek to get involved with its people. Anyone would have done the same, he muttered, wiping his hands on a cloth. Not true, Kate said quietly. Many would have walked away. Thomas looked at her, struck by the simple conviction in her voice. Something about her direct gaze made him feel seen in a way that was both discomforting and strangely compelling. I should get supplies if I'm to reach my property before nightfall, he said, deliberately changing the subject. Of course, Kate smiled, seemingly untroubled by his abrupt shift. Though you should know there's a storm brewing, the kind that turns the North Road to mud. You might consider waiting until morning. As if confirming her words, distant thunder rumbled. Thomas glanced at the darkening sky with frustration. Every instinct told him to get to his land, to establish his isolation as quickly as possible, yet her practical advice made sense. Perhaps you're right, he conceded. Since you're delayed anyway, would you consider escorting me to the community gathering tonight? Kate asked, her directness catching him off guard again. It's nothing formal, just supper at the church and some music. Newcomers are always welcome. Thomas opened his mouth to refuse, then found himself saying, What time should I call for you? Her smile widened. 6 o'clock at the general store. Uncle Jasper and I live in the rooms above. As she walked away, Thomas stood motionless, wondering what had possessed him to accept her invitation. Community gatherings meant questions, conversations, the very entanglements he'd sworn to avoid. Yet as he watched Katherine Baker's retreating figure, he realized he was looking forward to seeing her again. The thought was as unsettling as the storm clouds gathering overhead. The community gathering was exactly what Thomas had feared, friendly people asking well-intentioned questions about his past, his plans, his family. He kept his answers vague, mentioning only that he'd ranched in Colorado and was looking for a fresh start. Katherine seemed to sense his discomfort, skillfully redirecting conversations whenever they veered too close to topics he clearly wished to avoid. Her uncle Jasper proved equally perceptive, sharing information about local conditions that would be useful for a newcomer without pressing for Thomas's history. Winter comes early up here, Jasper explained as they enjoyed Mrs. Miller's apple pie. You'll want to get that cabin weatherproofed before the first snow. I've been meaning to ride up that way myself, Kate added. Perhaps I could show you the shortcuts through our property tomorrow, save you some time getting established. Thomas hesitated. Having Katherine Baker on his land, however briefly, seemed to contradict his plan for solitude. Yet he couldn't deny the practical value of local knowledge. That's generous of you, he said finally, if your uncle can spare you. Jasper waved a hand dismissively. Stores closed Sundays anyway. Besides, Katherine knows that area better than most. She's forever exploring when she should be keeping accounts. Kate's cheeks colored slightly, but she smiled. I'll meet you at the stables at 8 then. As the evening continued, Thomas found himself unwillingly drawn into the community's warmth. A local man produced a fiddle, another a harmonica, and soon people were dancing in the cleared space of the church hall. Do you dance, Mr. Yates? Kate asked, her brown eyes reflecting the lamplight. Not in a very long time, he admitted. Not since before the war, before he'd learned how quickly life could turn brutal. Perhaps it's like writing, she suggested, a skill that returns when needed. Before he could formulate an excuse, she had taken his hand and led him into the forming circle of dancers. The music caught them up, a lively reel that required no particular talent beyond willingness to move. Thomas found himself following Kate's lead, turning when she turned, stepping when she stepped, and then, unexpectedly, he was smiling. Really smiling for the first time in longer than he could remember. The realization almost made him stop, but Kate's hand was warm in his, her laughter infectious as they circled with the other dancers. Later, walking her back to the store through the gentle rain that had finally arrived, Thomas felt strangely off balance. One day in Cottonwood Creek had already entangled him more deeply with its people than he'd planned. Thank you for the escort, Mr. Yates, Kate said as they reached the store's entrance. Thomas, he corrected, surprising himself again. If we're to be neighbors, you might as well use my given name. Thomas then, her smile in the dim light made something shift in his chest. Until tomorrow. As he walked back to Mrs. Miller's boarding house. Thomas tried to recapture his determination to remain apart, to build his life in isolation. But Katherine Baker's smile kept intruding on his thoughts, along with the unsettling realization that he was looking forward to tomorrow. The rain had cleared by morning, leaving the world washed clean and the North Road muddy, just as Kate had predicted. Thomas met her at the stables, where she waited with a sturdy bay mare and saddlebags packed with what appeared to be a substantial lunch. Uncle Jasper insisted I bring provisions, she explained, seeing his raised eyebrow. He says men never pack enough food. They set out north, Katherine leading the way through town and then onto a trail that branched from the main road. True to her word, she guided him through Jasper's property and along paths that cut significant distance from the journey. "How do you know these trails so well?" Thomas asked as they rode side by side through a meadow bright with early summer wildflowers. "I came here when I was 16 after my parents died," she explained, her expression momentarily shadowed. "Uncle Jasper was my only family. I was so angry at first at God, at the world. I used to ride for hours, exploring every inch of the countryside. And now," she smiled, the shadow passing, "now I ride because I love it. This country gets into your blood, don't you think?" Thomas considered the landscape around them, the rolling hills giving way to more dramatic terrain, the distant mountains, the clear sky overhead. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that spoke to something in him. It might, he admitted, given time. They reached his property by mid-morning. The cabin stood in a small clearing near the creek, just as Porter had described. It was rough but sturdy, one room with a stone fireplace, a small porch, and a lean-to that could serve as a stable. The roof needed work and the chimney required cleaning, but it was a far better starting point than Thomas had expected. "It has good bones," Kate observed as they dismounted. "Mr. Harrison built solid foundations, at least." Thomas nodded, already mentally cataloging the repairs needed. "The creek seems reliable." "It runs year-round," she confirmed. "Even in the driest summers, your southern fields get the best sun exposure." She pointed to the sloping land beyond the cabin. "Good for crops if you're planning to farm rather than ranch." "A bit of both, I think. Enough cattle to build a small herd, enough crops to sustain myself." "Ambitious for one man alone," Kate remarked, her tone casual but her gaze assessing. Thomas busied himself checking the cabin's door, avoiding her eyes. "I prefer working alone. Most people around here help each other," she said. "Barn raisings, harvest assistance, cattle roundups. No one truly succeeds alone in this country." The observation hit too close to his determined self-reliance. "I've managed before." Kate didn't press the point, instead suggesting they explore the property boundaries before lunch. The diversion was welcome, and Thomas found her knowledge of local landmarks and conditions invaluable. She pointed out signs of game trails, locations where the creek was easily crossed, and areas where the soil would likely prove most fertile. They ate lunch beneath a large cottonwood near the creek, Katherine spreading a cloth and unpacking bread, cheese, cured meat, and Mrs. Miller's apple tarts. The simple meal tasted extraordinary after months of trail cooking. "Why Cottonwood Creek?" Kate asked as they finished eating. "Of all the places in the West, why here?" Thomas considered deflecting the question, but her direct gaze made evasion feel dishonest. "I needed somewhere new. Somewhere without memories." She nodded, accepting this partial truth without demanding more. Sometimes a fresh start is the greatest gift we can give ourselves. Something in her tone suggested personal experience. "Is that why you stayed? After coming to your uncle's?" A gentle smile touched her lips. "Partly. I had nowhere else to go at first, but later, when I might have left for a larger town, I realized I'd found my place here. Community means something in a frontier town. People look out for each other. And if someone prefers looking out for themselves," the question emerged more defensively than he'd intended. Katherine studied him, her brown eyes thoughtful. "Then I suppose they miss half the beauty of living, but it's their choice to make." Before Thomas could respond, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught his attention. He tensed, hand moving instinctively toward the pistol at his hip, before recognizing the form of a young black bear cub. "Don't move," he whispered to Kate, who had followed his gaze. "Where there's a cub," she began softly. The mother's nearby, he finished. We need to leave slowly. They gathered their things with deliberate care, keeping their movements smooth and quiet. Thomas helped Kate mount her horse, then swung into his own saddle. They backed away from the clearing at a walk, neither speaking until they were well clear of the area. That was exciting, Kate said finally, a trace of laughter in her voice. Despite his lingering tension, Thomas found himself smiling. One way of putting it. At least you know your land has game, she offered, though perhaps too close to the cabin for comfort. As they rode back toward town, taking a different route that Kate promised would show him more of the local terrain, Thomas found himself more at ease in her company than he'd been with anyone since Jake's death. Her straightforward manner and lack of prying questions made conversation easy, and her knowledge of the area proved genuinely helpful. When they reached the edge of town late in the afternoon, Thomas was surprised by his reluctance to end their day together. "Thank you for the guidance," he said as they stopped at the stables. "It was invaluable." "You're welcome," Kate dismounted with practiced grace. "When do you plan to move to the cabin?" "Tomorrow, if I can gather all the supplies I need." She nodded. "The church organization is holding a welcome dinner for new settlers next Sunday. I hope you'll consider attending once you're settled." Thomas hesitated. His instinct was to refuse, to maintain the distance he'd determined to keep from the town and its people. Yet he heard himself saying, "Perhaps I will." Kate's smile made something warm unfurl in his chest. "Until then, neighbor." As Thomas watched her lead her horse into the stable, he acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. Katherine Baker was becoming dangerously important to him, and he had no idea what to do about it. The following weeks fell into an unexpected pattern. Thomas moved to his cabin and threw himself into the work of making it habitable, patching the roof, cleaning the chimney, building basic furniture from lumber he hauled from town. He planted a small vegetable garden, repaired fencing, and began to clear additional land for crops. Despite his intention to remain apart from the community, he found himself in town every few days for supplies. Each visit somehow included an encounter with Katherine Baker, sometimes briefly at the store, other times longer conversations over coffee at the small restaurant that had opened beside the saloon. He attended the church welcome dinner, finding himself seated between Kate and her uncle Jasper. Other newcomers were there as well, a young doctor and his wife from Pennsylvania, a blacksmith from Ohio, a schoolteacher from New York. Thomas offered minimal information about himself, mentioning only that he'd come from Colorado seeking a fresh start. Kate never pressed for more, but Thomas often caught her studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, as though piecing together a puzzle from the fragments he revealed. June turned to July, bringing long, warm days that Thomas filled with constant labor. The work was good, honest, straightforward, demanding enough to exhaust him so thoroughly that nightmares visited less frequently. Slowly, the cabin and surrounding land began to take shape into something resembling a real home. One particularly hot afternoon, as Thomas repaired a section of fence, he looked up to see a wagon approaching. Kate sat in the driver's seat, handling the team with practiced ease. "Delivery service," she called as she brought the wagon to a halt. "Uncle Jasper mentioned you'd ordered supplies." Thomas set down his tools and approached. "I was planning to pick those up tomorrow." The supply wagon arrived early, and we needed the storage space. She smiled, wiping perspiration from her brow. "Besides, I wanted to see how your empire building was progressing." Thomas offered his hand to help her down from the wagon, acutely aware of her fingers curling around his. Since their day exploring his property, he'd been careful to maintain a certain physical distance, mindful of propriety and his own unsettling reactions to her presence. "It's no empire," he said as she surveyed his progress. "But it's coming along." "Better than coming along," Kate countered, taking in the improved cabin, the neat rows of vegetables, the cleared fields. "You've accomplished in weeks what takes most men months." "I don't have much else to occupy my time." It wasn't entirely true. He'd spent several days helping the blacksmith with a difficult job and had assisted Dr. Wilson twice more with patients requiring extra hands. Kate's knowing smile suggested she was aware of these community contributions. "Well, your one-man crusade is impressive nonetheless. Though you might consider a shade tree for your porch before you collapse from the heat." Thomas realized he was indeed sweat-soaked and exhausted, having worked through the hottest part of the day without break. "I'll take that under advisement." They unloaded the supplies together, Kate insisting on helping despite his protests. When the wagon was empty, she produced a covered basket from beneath the seat. "Mrs. Miller sent this. She says you're getting too thin." Inside the basket, Thomas found fresh bread, cold chicken, preserves, and a small apple pie. The thoughtfulness of the gesture left him momentarily speechless. "You should eat while it's still fresh," Kate suggested. "I can spare time for lunch before heading back." They sat on the cabin's porch steps, sharing the meal as a light breeze finally stirred the hot air. Thomas found himself describing his plans for the property, expanding the garden next year, adding a proper barn, eventually building a larger house. "Sounds like you're planning to stay," Kate observed. "That's good. Cottonwood Creek could use more permanent settlers rather than those just passing through." "What about you?" Thomas asked, suddenly curious. "Do you plan to stay with your uncle indefinitely?" A shadow crossed her face. "I've had offers to leave, marriage proposals." Thomas felt an unexpected surge of jealousy, followed immediately by self-reproach. He had no claim on Katherine Baker's future, none that appealed to you. He tried to keep his tone casual. "Mr. Dawson the banker is quite persistent. He's a widower with 2 young children," she sighed. "He's a good man, and his children need a mother." "But," Thomas prompted, hearing the unspoken reservation in her voice, "but marriage should be more than practical arrangement, don't you think?" Her brown eyes met his, unexpectedly vulnerable. "There should be connection, understanding." Thomas looked away, unable to hold her gaze. Some would say practical considerations matter more on the frontier. "And what would Thomas Yates say?" she asked quietly. The question hung between them, weighted with implications Thomas wasn't ready to confront. Before he could formulate a response, the distant sound of approaching riders saved him from answering. 3 men on horseback emerged from the tree line near the creek, riding directly toward the cabin. Thomas stood, instinctively placing himself between Kate and the newcomers. Something about their approach, too direct, too purposeful, set alarm bells ringing in his mind. "Afternoon," called the lead rider as they drew closer. He was a weathered man in his 40s, with a scar running along one cheek and eyes that assessed Thomas with cold calculation. "This the old Harrison place?" "It is," Thomas confirmed, keeping his voice neutral while his hand drifted toward the knife at his belt. He'd left his pistol inside the cabin, a careless oversight. "Understand," Harrison pulled out in a hurry. The man's gaze shifted to Kate, his expression changing in a way that made Thomas's jaw tighten. "Didn't mention he'd left such pretty company behind." "I'm Katherine Baker. My uncle owns the general store in town." Kate had risen to stand beside Thomas, her voice steady despite the tension vibrating in the air. "And you are?" "Name's Rollins. These are my associates, Cooper and Maddox." The man gestured to his companions, younger men with hard eyes and trail-worn clothing. "We're looking to acquire some property in these parts. Heard this place might be available." "You heard wrong," Thomas said flatly. "I purchased this land legally 3 weeks ago. I have the deed." Rollins's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Paperwork gets complicated out here, doesn't it?" "Mistakes happen." The implied threat was unmistakable. Thomas assessed the 3 men quickly, all armed, all watching him with the calculating patience of predators. "No mistakes with my deed," Thomas replied. "If you're interested in land, the agent in town can direct you to available parcels." "Maybe we like this parcel." Rollins let his hand rest on his holstered pistol. "Got good water, decent position, might be worth discussing a private sale." Katherine stepped forward, her movement drawing all eyes. "Mr. Rollins, I don't believe we've seen you in Cottonwood Creek before. Are you new to the territory?" The seemingly innocuous question carried subtle weight, a reminder that she was known in the community, that her absence would be noted. Thomas silently admired her quick thinking. Rollins seemed to recalculate, his expression shifting. "Just passing through, ma'am, considering options." "Then you'll want to speak with Mr. Porter at the land office," she continued smoothly. "And perhaps introduce yourselves to Sheriff Davis. He likes to know who's visiting our community." The mention of a sheriff, which Thomas knew was an exaggeration of the town's elderly part-time constable, caused the three men to exchange glances. "Maybe we'll do that," Rollins said after a moment. "Always best to follow proper channels." His gaze hardened as it returned to Thomas. "We'll be around a while, neighbor, plenty of time to discuss opportunities." The trio wheeled their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and palpable tension behind them. "Those men mean trouble," Kate said quietly when they were out of earshot. Thomas nodded grimly. "Land grabbers or worse." He'd seen their kind before, opportunists who used intimidation and violence to acquire property they could later sell to larger interests or development companies. "You should tell Constable Davis," Kate suggested. "He may be old, but he has connections with the territorial authorities." "I'll handle it." Thomas's voice was harder than he'd intended. Kate studied his face. "You've dealt with men like that before." It wasn't a question, but Thomas answered anyway. "Yes." "Is that why you left Colorado?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. Thomas looked at Katherine, really looked at her, and saw no judgment in her expression, only concern. "Partly," he admitted. "There was trouble, men died, one of them was like a brother to me." Kate's hand touched his arm, gentle but firm. "I'm sorry, Thomas." The simple words, the genuine compassion in her eyes, broke something loose inside him. For the first time since Jake's death, Thomas felt the rigid control he maintained over his emotions begin to crack. "You should head back to town," he said, his voice rough. "It'll be dark soon." Kate nodded, understanding his need for space. "Will you come to the Founders' Day celebration this weekend?" "The whole town will be there." Thomas almost refused automatically, then reconsidered. After Rollins's visit, maintaining connections in town seemed suddenly more practical than isolated self-reliance. "I'll try," he said. As he watched her wagon disappear down the road, Thomas acknowledged two uncomfortable truths. Dangerous men had found their way to Cottonwood Creek, and despite his best efforts, Katherine Baker had become someone he couldn't bear to see harmed. The Founders' Day celebration transformed Cottonwood Creek from a quiet frontier settlement into a bustling hub of activity. Bunting decorated the main street, tables laden with food lined the area near the church, and a platform had been erected for speeches and music. Thomas arrived mid-afternoon, uncomfortably aware of the attention his presence drew. He'd made an effort with his appearance, clean-shaven, hair trimmed, wearing his best shirt and least-worn pants. Mrs. Miller had insisted on pressing his shirt when he'd stopped at the boarding house to wash up. He spotted Kate immediately, her chestnut hair arranged more formally than usual, wearing a dress of deep blue that complemented her coloring. She was helping organize children for some type of game, laughing as she arranged them in lines. "Yates, glad you made it." Jasper Henley approached, offering his hand. "Katherine was worried you'd decide to keep working through the celebration." "Thought I'd see what all the fuss was about," Thomas replied, shaking the offered hand. "Been meaning to ride out to your place," Jasper continued. "See if you need anything. Katherine mentioned some unsavory characters paid you a visit." Thomas nodded. "Three men," said their leader's name was Rollins. Jasper's expression darkened. "I've heard that name, troublemaker over in Dakota Territory. Rumor has it he works for Eastern mining interests, securing land through whatever means necessary." "I reported them to Constable Davis," Thomas said. "For whatever that's worth." "Davis may look like he should have retired a decade ago, but he's shrewder than he appears," Jasper assured him. "He's already sent word to the territorial marshal." Their conversation was interrupted as Kate noticed Thomas and approached, her smile warming something cold inside him. "You came," she said, sounding genuinely pleased, "and looking quite civilized too." "Mrs. Miller's influence," Thomas admitted. "She threatened to withhold pie if I didn't make an effort." Kate laughed, the sound drawing Thomas's attention to the delicate curve of her throat. "A powerful incentive. Come, let me introduce you to people you haven't met yet." The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and conversations. Thomas met the schoolteacher, Miss Watson, who questioned him earnestly about his reading preferences. The blacksmith, Ferguson, discussed the quality of different metal stock available in the territory. Dr. Wilson's wife invited him to Sunday dinner with such genuine warmth that Thomas found himself accepting before he'd fully considered the implications. Throughout it all, Kate remained nearby, smoothing awkward moments and guiding conversations toward topics where Thomas seemed comfortable. Her attentiveness should have made him uneasy, evidence of how well she was coming to read him, but instead, he found it oddly comforting. As the afternoon progressed into evening, lanterns were lit and the fiddler began playing. Couples formed for dancing, and Thomas watched from the sidelines, nursing a cup of cider. Not joining the dancing this time, Kate appeared beside him, her cheeks flushed from exertion. She'd been dancing with several of the town's younger men, including the new doctor. Observing, Thomas replied. Well, observe all you want, but save me a dance before the night's over, she said, then disappeared back into the crowd as another young man claimed her attention. Thomas watched her go, aware of an unfamiliar emotion taking root. It took him a moment to recognize it as contentment, something he hadn't expected to feel again. The moment was shattered by a commotion at the edge of the gathering. Rollins and his two companions had arrived, their presence immediately changing the celebration's atmosphere. They weren't openly causing trouble, but their hard gazes and the way they positioned themselves, backs to the wall, clear views of all approaches, spoke of men accustomed to violence. Thomas set down his cider and moved closer to where Kate was now helping serve food. She noticed his approach and raised a questioning eyebrow. Rollins and his men are here, Thomas said quietly. By the saloon entrance. Kate glanced in the indicated direction, her expression hardening. Looking for trouble, I suspect. Or making their presence known, establishing themselves. Thomas had seen the tactic before, intimidation through visibility, letting everyone know they were players to be reckoned with. Should we tell Constable Davis? He already knows, Thomas nodded toward the elderly lawman who was watching the newcomers with narrowed eyes. The festivities continued, but a subtle tension had entered the air. People glanced more frequently toward the three strangers, conversations became more subdued, and parents drew children closer. When the music resumed, Thomas surprised himself by approaching Kate. I believe you requested a dance. Her smile chased away some of the tension. I did indeed. The fiddle struck up a waltz, slower and more intimate than the lively reels from earlier. Thomas hesitated, suddenly unsure. Just follow my lead, Kate murmured, placing one hand in his and the other on his shoulder. I won't steer you wrong. Thomas found the steps returning to him as they moved, muscle memory from a life that seemed to belong to someone else. Kate was right, she was an excellent lead while appearing to follow, subtly guiding him through turns and steps. You clean up nicely, Thomas Yates, she said as they circled the improvised dance floor. You should come to town more often. Not much call for clean shirts when repairing fences, he replied, hyper-aware of her hand in his, the slight pressure of her fingers on his shoulder. There's more to life than fences, Kate's brown eyes met his, serious despite her light tone, even on the frontier. Before Thomas could respond, a disturbance at the food tables caught everyone's attention. Maddox, the youngest of Rollins's men, was arguing loudly with one of the town's residents. Called me a thief, the young townsman was shouting. I never took nothing. Maddox's hand hovered near his pistol. Then explain how my money pouch got lighter after you bumped into me, boy. The dancing stopped as all eyes turned toward the confrontation. Thomas released Kate's hand and moved toward the disturbance, positioning himself to intervene if necessary. Constable Davis arrived first, his aged frame belying the authority in his voice. That's enough, no fighting during Founder's Day. This ain't about fighting, old man, Maddox sneered. It's about justice. This thief took my money. Turn out your pockets, Jimmy, Davis instructed the young man. Jimmy Thompson, a 19-year-old who worked at the livery, emptied his pockets indignantly. They contained only a few coins, a pocket knife, and a handkerchief. See, nothing of yours, Jimmy declared. Maddox's expression turned ugly. He must have passed it to someone else. Or you're mistaken, Davis countered. Maybe you spent more at the saloon than you recall. Rollins appeared beside his associate, his calculating gaze sweeping the gathering. My friend isn't known for mistakes, Constable. If he says he was robbed, then someone here has his money. The accusation hung in the air, casting a pall over the entire celebration. Thomas noticed Rollins's third man, Cooper, had positioned himself strategically, hand resting on his holstered pistol. I won't have visitors accusing my townsfolk without evidence, Davis said firmly. If you've lost money, I'll investigate properly, but not by disrupting our celebration. Tension crackled between the elderly lawman and Rollins. Thomas shifted his position slightly, preparing to intervene if the confrontation escalated to violence. After a long moment, Rollins smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. Of course, Constable, we wouldn't want to spoil the festivities. He placed a restraining hand on Maddox's arm. We'll discuss this matter another time. The three men withdrew toward the saloon, but the damage was done. The celebration's joyful atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by unease and whispered conversations. Thomas found Kate at his elbow. That was deliberately timed, she observed quietly. They wanted to disrupt everything. Testing boundaries, Thomas agreed, seeing how the town responds to provocation. Kate's expression was troubled. Why? What do they want? Thomas looked toward where Rollins had paused in the saloon doorway, his gaze meeting Thomas's with unmistakable challenge. I'm not entirely sure, Thomas admitted. But I intend to find out. The music eventually resumed, but with subdued energy. Thomas remained close to Kate for the remainder of the evening, walking her home when the celebration finally wound down. Be careful, Thomas, she said at the store's entrance. Those men are dangerous. I'm aware, more aware than she knew. He'd recognized the look in Rollins's eyes, the calculating assessment of a man who eliminated obstacles without remorse. Kate studied his face in the lamplight. You're not telling me everything about your past, are you? The directness of the question caught him off guard, though it shouldn't have. Katherine Baker had proven remarkably perceptive about him from their first meeting. No, he admitted, some things are better left buried. Unless they follow you, her hand touched his arm, warm through the fabric of his shirt. Whatever you're running from, Thomas, whatever happened in Colorado, you don't have to face it alone, not anymore. The simple declaration struck him like a physical blow. Thomas looked down at Katherine's upturned face, at the sincerity in her brown eyes, and felt the carefully constructed walls around his heart begin to crumble. Good night, Katherine, he said softly, unable to trust himself with more words. She smiled, seeming to understand what he couldn't express. Good night, Thomas. As he walked back to his horse, Thomas was acutely aware of Rollins watching from the saloon porch, tracking his movements with predatory interest. The man raised his glass in mocking salute, his message clear: this isn't over. Thomas returned to his cabin that night with two certainties. Dangerous men had set their sights on Cottonwood Creek, and Katherine Baker had somehow become essential to a future he'd stopped believing he deserved. The next 2 weeks brought increasing tension to Cottonwood Creek. Rollins and his men took rooms at the saloon, becoming a constant presence in town. No overt trouble occurred, but their watchful presence cast a shadow over daily activities. Thomas divided his time between working his land and making excuses to visit town. He told himself these frequent trips were to gather information about Rollins, but he couldn't deny that each visit included time with Katherine. Their relationship had shifted subtly since Founders Day. Something unspoken had developed between them, a deeper connection neither had directly acknowledged but both seemed to recognize. They spoke of everyday matters, his progress on the cabin, her work at the store, local news, but beneath the ordinary conversations ran a current of growing attachment. One afternoon, as Thomas repaired a broken wheel on his wagon, Jasper Henley rode up to his cabin. The storekeeper's usually cheerful expression was serious. Thought you should know, Jasper said after dismounting. Rollins has been asking questions about property boundaries and mineral rights. Specifically about the creek that runs through your land. Thomas straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. What kind of questions? Technical ones about the original survey, water rights, whether anyone's tested for gold. Jasper accepted the cup of coffee Thomas offered. Porter at the land office thinks they're looking for legal loopholes to challenge property claims. Has anyone found gold in the creek? Thomas asked, thinking of the creek's clear waters. Jasper shook his head. Not that I've heard. But there's rumors of strikes in similar terrain about 40 miles north. Might be they're speculating. Thomas considered this information, or they already know something we don't. That's my worry, Jasper admitted. 3 days ago, I caught Cooper examining the territory map in the store when he thought no one was looking. Katherine has since noticed papers missing from the land office, old survey documents. A cold certainty settled in Thomas's stomach. They're planning something bigger than simple intimidation. Territorial Marshal should arrive within the week, Jasper said. Davis sent for him after Founders Day. Until then, folks are watching their backs. How's Katherine? Thomas asked, the question emerging before he could reconsider it. Something knowing flickered in Jasper's eyes, worried about everyone but herself, as usual. Rollins has taken to visiting the store daily, claims he's just purchasing supplies, but he lingers, asking her questions. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. What kind of questions? About how long she's been here, her background, her attachment to the community. Jasper's gaze was direct. And about you. Me. Thomas set down his coffee cup, suddenly alert. Your history, how well she knows you, whether you've mentioned your past. Jasper's expression grew grave. I don't like it, Thomas. He's taking too much interest in both of you. A horrible suspicion began forming in Thomas's mind, one that connected Rollins's interest in him with the timing of the man's arrival in Cottonwood Creek. Has he mentioned Colorado? Thomas asked, his voice tightly controlled. Jasper's eyebrows rose. Not that Katherine's told me. Should he have? No, Thomas shook his head. Just wondering how thorough his questions have been. After Jasper departed, Thomas remained on his porch, watching the sun sink toward the distant mountains. If Rollins was asking about his past, it might not be coincidence that brought the man to Cottonwood Creek precisely when Thomas was establishing himself. The possibility that his past might endanger Katherine and the town that had welcomed him was intolerable. Decision made, Thomas saddled his horse and rode toward town, planning to reach it by nightfall. He needed to warn Katherine, to make sure she understood the potential danger, and to tell her the truth he'd been avoiding. Thomas arrived in Cottonwood Creek as twilight deepened into night. Lights burned in windows along the main street, including the lamps above the general store where Katherine and her uncle lived. As he approached the store, intending to knock at the side entrance that led to their private quarters, voices from the alley caught his attention. One was unmistakably Katherine's, her tone sharp with anger. The other belonged to Rollins. Thomas dismounted silently, tethering his horse to a post before moving toward the voices. He kept to the shadows, instinctively slipping into the stealthy movement he'd learned during the war. Don't appreciate your implications, Mr. Rollins. Katherine's voice was cold, and I've answered enough questions about Mr. Yates. His business is his own. His business might concern this entire town, Miss Baker. Rollins's voice held false concern. A man with his history. Whatever history you're implying, I suggest you discuss it with him directly. Katherine's reply was firm. Now if you'll excuse me. Thomas heard footsteps as Katherine attempted to move past Rollins, then a scuffling sound and Katherine's sharp intake of breath. Let go of my arm. Her voice remained steady despite the evident threat. We're not finished discussing your friend Yates, Rollins said, his tone hardening. Or should I call him by the name he used in Colorado, the one associated with 6 dead men? Thomas stepped into the alley, his movement deliberate now. Let her go, Rollins. Both figures turned toward him. Rollins still gripped Katherine's arm, but his free hand hovered near his holstered pistol. Katherine's expression showed relief at Thomas's appearance, but also concern. Well, well. The man himself, Rollins smiled unpleasantly. We were just discussing your colorful past. I said let her go. Thomas advanced steadily, his own hand nowhere near his weapon but his stance clearly threatening. After a tense moment, Rollins released Katherine's arm. She immediately moved away from him, coming to stand near Thomas. You should be more careful about the company you keep, Miss Baker, Rollins said, his eyes never leaving Thomas. Your friend here has blood on his hands, quite a lot of it. Whatever you think you know, Thomas began. I know exactly who you are, Rollins interrupted. Thomas Yates, formerly employed by the Banning Ranch in Colorado. Present during a dispute that left 6 men dead, including Banning's son and a man named Jacob Winters. The precision of the information confirmed Thomas's worst fears. Rollins hadn't come to Cottonwood Creek by chance. What do you want? Thomas asked, his voice flat. Rollins smiled thinly. Justice for starters. Compensation for grieving families, perhaps, or maybe just the satisfaction of watching you lose everything you've built here when the truth comes out. The truth isn't what you're suggesting, Thomas said, acutely aware of Katherine beside him, hearing every word. We'll see what the town thinks when they learn what happened at Banning Ranch, Rollins replied. How much trust will they place in a man with your history? With a mock tip of his hat toward Katherine, Rollins sauntered past them and into the main street, his point made. In the silence that followed, Thomas couldn't bring himself to look at Katherine. The shame and anger he'd carried since Colorado burned in his chest, made worse by the knowledge that she'd heard Rollins's accusations. Thomas, her hand touched his arm, gentle but insistent. Look at me. Reluctantly, he met her gaze. Instead of the judgment or fear he'd expected, her brown eyes held only concern. Whatever happened in Colorado, whatever he's implying, I trust you, she said simply. The straightforward declaration stunned him. You can't know that what he said isn't true. I know you, Katherine replied. I've seen you help injured miners, assist Dr. Wilson, teach Jimmy Thompson how to properly shoe a horse. Those aren't the actions of the man Rollins described. Thomas looked away, her faith in him almost harder to bear than condemnation would have been. People died because of choices I made, that part's true. Then tell me what happened, Kate said, all of it so I can understand. Thomas hesitated, then nodded toward the store's side entrance. Not here. Inside. In the private sitting room above the store, with lamps lit and coffee poured, Thomas finally told the story he'd been running from. Katherine and Jasper listened without interruption as he described his time at Banning Ranch, how he'd been hired as a ranch hand but quickly promoted to foreman due to his skills with cattle and horses. Banning was expanding, buying up smaller ranches, sometimes using methods that weren't entirely legal, Thomas explained. I didn't know the extent of it at first. Jake, my friend, and I just did our jobs. He described how tensions had escalated with neighboring ranchers who refused to sell. How Banning's son, Edwin, had led increasingly aggressive actions against these holdouts. There was a family named Cordova. Their ranch was small but had the best water access in the region. Edwin wanted their land, but old man Cordova refused to sell at any price. Thomas's voice grew tight with remembered anger. Edwin decided to force the issue. He ordered me to take some men and drive the Cordovas off their land, burn them out if necessary. What did you do? Katherine asked quietly. I refused, said I wouldn't be part of it. Thomas stared into his coffee cup, avoiding their eyes. Edwin called me disloyal, threatened my job. I told him I'd quit rather than attack innocent people. The confrontation had become physical, with Edwin drawing his pistol. Thomas had disarmed him, humiliating the younger Banning in front of the ranch hands. I should have left immediately, Thomas continued, but I stayed to pack my things, to talk to Jake about leaving together. That delay cost lives. While Thomas was gathering his belongings, Edwin had taken several loyal hands and ridden to the Cordova ranch. By the time Thomas and Jake arrived, following a warning from another ranch hand, the buildings were burning and gunfire was being exchanged. We tried to stop it to help the Cordovas. Thomas's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. There was so much confusion, smoke, shouting, bullets. I saw Edwin aim at Cordova's youngest son. He couldn't have been more than 16. I tackled Edwin, and in the struggle, his gun went off. The bullet had struck Edwin in the chest. As he fell, dying, his father had arrived with more men, seeing only that Thomas was standing over his son's body. All hell broke loose after that. Banning's men started firing at anyone they didn't recognize as their own. Jake was hit trying to get the Cordova family to safety. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. By the time it was over, Edwin and 5 others were dead, including Jake and 2 of the Cordovas. And Banning blamed you for all of it, Jasper said, speaking for the first time. Thomas nodded. He swore he'd see me hang. Said I'd murdered his son, that I'd orchestrated the entire confrontation. The territorial authorities had investigated, ultimately ruling that Edwin's death occurred during a chaotic firefight with responsibility impossible to assign clearly. The Cordovas, fearing further reprisals, had sold their land and moved away. Banning had been forced to accept the official finding, but his hatred of Thomas had only intensified. I couldn't stay in Colorado after that. Not with Banning telling anyone who'd listen that I was a murderer. Thomas finally looked up, meeting Catherine's steady gaze. So I came here, thinking I could outrun the past. And now Rollins has brought it to your doorstep, she said softly. Why, what does he gain? Rollins works for Banning, Thomas said with certainty. He's here to drive me out, or worse, to provoke me into giving Banning the excuse he needs to finish what he started. Jasper frowned, but why now? Why follow you all the way to Montana? It's not just about me anymore, Thomas's expression hardened. Rollins has been asking about mineral rights, examining maps. I think they've discovered something valuable, maybe gold in the creek that runs through my property. Driving me out serves Banning's vendetta and gets them access to whatever they've found. The three sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications of this theory. We need to tell Constable Davis, Katherine said finally, and wait for the territorial marshal. If Rollins is working for Banning, his claims have no legal standing. Thomas shook his head. Rollins isn't here for legal proceedings. He's here to create trouble, to turn the town against me, or provoke a confrontation that ends with me dead or forced to run again. Then we won't let him succeed, Katherine said firmly, reaching across the table to take his hand. You're not alone this time, Thomas. You have people who believe in you. The warmth of her hand around his, the unwavering conviction in her eyes, created a tightness in Thomas's chest. After everything she'd heard, Katherine still looked at him with trust, with something that might even be love. Rollins won't stop at turning the town against me, Thomas warned. If that fails, he'll escalate. Anyone associated with me could be in danger. The implication was clear. Katherine herself might become a target. I'm not afraid of Rollins or his men, she said, her chin lifting with characteristic determination. And I won't let them drive away someone who belongs in Cottonwood Creek. Belongs, the word resonated through Thomas's consciousness. For the first time since Jake's death, someone was claiming him as part of a community, as someone who belonged. Catherine's right, Jasper said, his expression thoughtful. The town needs to know what's happening, not Rollins's version, but the truth. People here have come to respect you, Thomas. They won't be easily turned. Thomas wanted to believe them, but experience had taught him harsh lessons about human nature. Rollins is clever. He'll twist the truth, play on fears. Then we'll be cleverer, Katherine said with simple confidence. Starting tomorrow. As Thomas rode back to his cabin that night, her words echoed in his mind. For the first time since arriving in Montana, he allowed himself to consider a future beyond mere survival, a future that included Katherine Baker and the community that had, almost against his will, become important to him. But first, he would have to face Rollins and the past that had followed him to Cottonwood Creek. The confrontation came sooner than expected. The following afternoon, as Thomas worked in his small field, 3 riders approached from the direction of town. Rollins led, flanked by Cooper and Maddox. Thomas set down his tools and walked to meet them, stopping near the cabin where his rifle stood propped against the porch rail, close enough to reach if needed. Afternoon, Yates, Rollins called, reining in his horse. Thought we should continue our conversation from last night. Nothing more to discuss, Thomas replied evenly. Rollins dismounted, his men following suit but remaining slightly behind him. I disagree. We have a proposition for you. Not interested. You haven't heard it yet, Rollins smiled thinly. It's quite generous, considering your circumstances. Thomas remained silent, watching the 3 men with careful attention to their positions and the placement of their hands near weapons. Banning is willing to be reasonable, Rollins continued. He'll drop his pursuit of justice for his son's death in exchange for your property. Sign over the deed, leave Montana territory, and you'll never hear from him again. The confirmation that Rollins worked for Banning was expected, but still sent a surge of anger through Thomas. There's no justice to pursue. The territorial authorities in Colorado cleared me. Legal technicalities, Rollins said dismissively. Banning knows who's responsible for his son's death, but he's a businessman first. This land, he gestured toward the creek, has value that might balance the scales. What value? Thomas asked, though he suspected the answer. Rollins's smile widened slightly. Let's just say our geologist found interesting samples in that creek bed, samples worth considerably more than what you'd make ranching this land for a lifetime. Gold, the word hung in the air between them. Enough to make Banning forget his grievances, Rollins confirmed. Enough to make you a wealthy man elsewhere if you're sensible. Thomas considered the offer not because he intended to accept, but to gain information. And if I refuse? Rollins's expression hardened. Then Banning will pursue all avenues available to him, legal and otherwise, starting with making sure every person in Cottonwood Creek knows they're harboring a killer. They already know what happened in Colorado, Thomas said, the lie coming easily. I told them last night. A flicker of surprise crossed Rollins's face before he masked it. Your version, perhaps, but how will they feel when they learn you're withholding prosperity from the entire community? That your stubbornness is preventing development that could make this backwater town into something significant. The threat was cleverly constructed, appealing to community interest rather than personal vengeance. Thomas had seen similar tactics work in other frontier towns, where economic opportunity often trumped personal loyalty. Cottonwood Creek isn't that kind of town, Thomas said, more confidently than he felt. Every town is that kind of town when enough money is involved, Rollins countered, but this doesn't have to become unpleasant. Sign over the property, take a generous payment, and move on. Everyone benefits. Except the next rancher Banning decides to target, Thomas said, or the one after that. Rollins shrugged, not your concern once you're gone. Thomas looked past him toward the distant mountains, considering his options. Running again would be easiest, taking Banning's money and disappearing, but it would mean abandoning everything he'd begun to build here, everyone he'd begun to care about. Everyone, Katherine's face appeared in his mind, her direct gaze, her quiet strength, her unwavering belief in him. My answer is no, Thomas said finally. This is my land, legally purchased. I'm not leaving. Rollins's expression darkened. You're making a serious mistake, Yates. Wouldn't be the first, Thomas replied evenly, but this time I'm choosing to stand my ground. The three men remounted their horses, Rollins's cold gaze never leaving Thomas. I'll give you 1 day to reconsider. After that, what happens will be on your head. As they rode away, Thomas remained motionless, watching until they disappeared from sight. Then he gathered his rifle, saddled his horse, and rode toward town. He needed to warn Katherine and Jasper about what was coming. Thomas found Cottonwood Creek already buzzing with tension. News traveled fast in small communities, and Katherine had clearly wasted no time. As he rode down the main street, he noticed people watching him, not with suspicion, as Rollins might have hoped, but with concern. At the general store, Katherine was serving customers, but her face brightened visibly when he entered. The elderly woman she was helping smiled knowingly between them. Thomas, Katherine said when the customer had departed. I was hoping you'd come to town today. Rollins paid me a visit, he said without preamble, made an offer for my land. Katherine's expression turned serious, because of what's in the creek. Thomas nodded. He as good as confirmed it's gold, said Banning sent him specifically to acquire my property. Uncle Jasper is meeting with some of the town's business owners right now, Katherine said. After you left last night, we decided the community needed to be prepared for whatever Rollins might do next. You've been telling people about Colorado? Thomas asked, uncertain how he felt about his past being discussed openly. Only the truth, and only to those who needed to know immediately. Her hand touched his arm reassuringly. No one blames you for what happened, Thomas. If anything, they respect you more for trying to protect the Cordova family. Before Thomas could respond, the store's door opened to admit Jasper, accompanied by Dr. Wilson, the blacksmith Ferguson, and surprisingly, Constable Davis. Yates, Davis greeted him with a nod. Henley's been filling us in about your situation with Rollins and this man Banning. Thomas looked at the group, seeing not the judgment he'd feared, but the concerned faces of men who had, somehow, become his community. Rollins offered to buy my land today, he told them. Said there's gold in the creek that runs through my property. When I refused, he threatened to turn the town against me, or worse. Davis nodded as though this confirmed his suspicions. Been watching those three since they arrived. They're troublemakers, sure enough. Got word this morning that the marshal was delayed dealing with a situation near Fort Benton. Won't be here for at least another week. That may be too late, Thomas said grimly. Rollins gave me 1 day to reconsider his offer. After that, he implied things would get ugly. Ferguson the blacksmith crossed his massive arms. Let them try, Cottonwood Creek looks after its own. The simple declaration, so similar to Katherine's assertion that Thomas belonged, left him momentarily speechless. We've already spoken with most of the business owners and prominent citizens, Jasper explained. Everyone understands the situation. No one's going to be swayed by whatever tales Rollins tries to spread. It's not just about rumors, Thomas warned. If there really is gold in that creek, Rollins won't stop at turning opinion against me. Banning wants that land, and he's not above using violence to get it. Which is why we need to be prepared, Dava said. I may be old, but I've dealt with claim jumpers and troublemakers before. We'll organize a watch rotation, make sure no one's caught alone or vulnerable. As the men discussed security arrangements, Thomas felt Katherine's hand slip into his. He looked down to find her watching him with quiet confidence. See, she said softly, not alone this time. The simple touch, the certainty in her voice, broke through the last of Thomas's carefully constructed defenses. In that moment, he admitted to himself what he'd been denying for weeks. He loved Katherine Baker with a depth that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Thank you, he said, the words entirely inadequate for what he felt. Her smile suggested she understood anyway. The meeting continued, plans taking shape for defending the town against whatever Rollins might attempt. Thomas listened and contributed, but part of his awareness remained fixed on Katherine beside him, on the newfound certainty that he could not run again. Cottonwood Creek was home now, Katherine was home, and this time he would stand and fight for what mattered. The following day passed in tense preparation. Thomas remained in town, helping organize the community's defense. Men with military experience, including Thomas himself, conducted informal training sessions. The blacksmith worked late into the night repairing neglected firearms. Women prepared provisions and medical supplies, led by Dr. Wilson's efficient wife. Throughout it all, Katherine remained a steady presence at Thomas's side. They found few moments alone, but when their eyes met across a busy room or their hands touched briefly while passing supplies, an entire conversation seemed to pass between them. By nightfall, Cottonwood Creek had transformed from a peaceful settlement into a community prepared for trouble. Armed men took positions at key locations, following the watch schedule Davis had established. Families with children were consolidated into a few defensible buildings near the center of town. As darkness deepened, Thomas found Katherine on the store's small back porch, gazing toward the distant mountains barely visible against the night sky. You should be resting, he said, joining her at the railing. Tomorrow may be difficult. I was thinking the same about you, she replied with a small smile, but I suspect neither of us will sleep much tonight. Thomas nodded, his shoulder brushing against hers as he leaned on the railing. The simple contact sent awareness through him, a reminder of everything that remained unspoken between them. Katherine, he began, then hesitated, uncertain how to express the emotions that had been building within him. Thomas, she echoed, turning to face him. The moonlight caught the planes of her face, softening them, highlighting the gentle curve of her cheek. I need to tell you, he tried again, but she placed a finger against his lips, stopping his words. Not now, she said softly, not with uncertainty hanging over us. Tell me when this is over, when we can look forward without shadows from the past. Thomas caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm before lowering it. And if something happens tomorrow, if Rollins... Nothing will happen, Katherine interrupted with quiet certainty. We'll face whatever comes together, and then we'll have time for everything that needs saying. Her confidence was a balm to his lingering doubts. Thomas found himself nodding, accepting her wisdom in postponing declarations that deserved to be made in freedom, not under threat. Together then, he agreed, the word a promise. Katherine smiled, reaching up to touch his cheek briefly before stepping back. You should check on the men at the North Watch position. I heard Ferguson mention they needed more ammunition. Thomas recognized her gentle dismissal, her way of maintaining the propriety they both respected despite the emotions simmering between them. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement and turned to go. Thomas, she called as he reached the steps. When he looked back, her expression was serious. Be careful tomorrow. Always, he promised, though both knew that confrontation with Rollins and his men was inevitable. The night passed without incident, though tension remained high. By dawn, Thomas had managed only a few hours of restless sleep on a cot in the back room of the general store. He rose early, checking positions and ensuring everyone remained alert. Mid-morning brought the first sign of trouble. A rider from the north reported seeing a large group approaching, at least 15 men, heavily armed, with Rollins in the lead. More than we expected, Davis said grimly when Thomas relayed this information. Must have telegraphed for reinforcements after you refused his offer. Thomas nodded, his expression hardening. They'll likely split up, approach from multiple directions, classic cattle war tactic. We've got 30 men of fighting age, Ferguson calculated, most with at least some experience handling firearms. Against professional gunmen, Thomas cautioned. Don't underestimate them. Banning hires the worst kind of men for his dirty work. Katherine approached, carrying coffee for the men gathered in the makeshift command center they'd established in the saloon. Mrs. Wilson says all the medical supplies are prepared. The children and elderly are secure in the church basement. Thomas accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, noting the calm efficiency with which Katherine had helped organize the town's women. She showed no fear despite the approaching danger, only the same quiet determination he'd come to associate with her. They'll be here within the hour, Davis estimated. Last chance for anyone to reconsider their position. Thomas understood the implication. He could still surrender his land, still accept Rollins's offer and spare the town potential bloodshed. Before he could respond, Katherine spoke firmly. This isn't just about Thomas's land anymore. It's about whether Cottonwood Creek stands together against those who use intimidation and violence to take what isn't theirs. Murmurs of agreement rose from the gathered men. Thomas looked at their resolved faces, neighbors and friends he hadn't realized he'd made until this moment of crisis revealed the connections that had formed despite his determination to remain apart. Katherine's right, Jasper said. If we let them drive out one of us with these tactics, who will be next? The precedent matters. Thomas felt a surge of gratitude for these people who had, against all expectations, become his community. Then we stand together, he said, but we don't shoot first. We show Rollins that Cottonwood Creek is united, but we don't give him the excuse he's looking for to claim self-defense. Davis nodded approval. Wise approach. We'll position our people accordingly. As the men dispersed to their assigned locations, Thomas caught Katherine's arm gently. You should stay inside, away from potential danger. Her expression told him what she thought of that suggestion before she even spoke. I'll be helping Dr. Wilson as planned, and before you argue, she raised a hand to forestall his protest. The doctor's station is in the most secure building, with multiple armed men for protection. Thomas knew that look of determination well enough now to recognize the futility of arguing. Instead, he squeezed her hand briefly. Be careful. You too, she replied, her eyes conveying everything words couldn't. Rollins's force arrived precisely as the lookout had described. 15 men, heavily armed, approaching the town's northern edge where the road passed Thomas's property before reaching Cottonwood Creek proper. Thomas stood on the main street with Davis and several other men, watching their approach. The town appeared deceptively normal, though armed defenders waited behind windows and at strategic positions, invisible to the approaching riders. Steady, Davis murmured as the riders drew closer. Let them make the first move. Rollins reined in at the edge of town, his men spreading out behind him in a loose formation that Thomas recognized as a standard intimidation tactic. Cooper and Maddox flanked their leader, hands resting near holstered weapons. Quite a welcome committee, Rollins called, his gaze fixing on Thomas. I take it this means you've reconsidered my generous offer. The offer was never yours to make, Thomas replied evenly. This land belongs to Cottonwood Creek and its citizens. You have no claim here. Rollins's expression hardened. I speak for Edward Banning, who has legitimate business interests in this territory. Interests that your obstinance is blocking. There's nothing legitimate about threatening a town to seize property, Davis interjected, stepping forward. As constable, I'm asking you and your men to turn around and leave Cottonwood Creek. A mocking smile spread across Rawlins's face. "Or what, old man, you'll arrest us all?" His gaze swept the visible defenders. "You're outmatched and outgunned, be sensible." "Are they?" The new voice came from behind Rawlins's group. All heads turned to see a line of riders approaching from the south, at least 20 men, all armed, led by a tall figure Thomas didn't recognize. Rawlins's expression showed brief surprise before settling into calculation. "This doesn't concern outsiders. When it threatens a community I'm sworn to protect, it concerns me directly." The leader of the new group urged his horse forward, revealing a silver star pinned to his vest. "Marshal Harlan Reeves, Montana Territory, and you'd be Rawlins, I presume." The territorial marshal's arrival changed the dynamics instantly. Rawlins's men shifted uneasily, looking to their leader for direction. "We're here on legitimate business," Rawlins insisted, though his confidence had visibly diminished, "negotiating a land purchase." "With 15 armed men," Reeves raised an eyebrow. "That's not negotiation, that's intimidation." "And it stops now." Thomas watched the marshal with cautious hope. The man's timing was either incredibly fortunate or, "Got your telegram yesterday morning," Reeves said to Davis, confirming Thomas's suspicion that the elderly constable had been more proactive than he'd let on. "Thought we'd approach from the south, just in case Mr. Rawlins had posted lookouts." Rawlins's expression had turned calculating. "This changes nothing. Banning will pursue legal avenues if necessary." "The mineral rights belong to the property owner," Reeves interrupted, "and any claim jumping or intimidation will be met with the full force of territorial law." He gestured to his deputies. "My men will escort you and your associates to the territorial line. Any return will result in immediate arrest." The standoff lasted several tense moments, with Rawlins clearly weighing his options. Finally he turned to Thomas with naked hatred. "This isn't over, Yates. Banning doesn't forget, and neither do I." "It's over in Montana Territory," Marshal Reeves stated firmly. "And I'll be sending communications to my counterparts in neighboring territories about your methods. Your employer's reach has limits, Mr. Rawlins." With no viable alternative, Rawlins signaled his men to withdraw. Under the watchful eyes of Reeves's deputies, they turned their horses and began riding north. As they disappeared from view, the tension that had held Cottonwood Creek in its grip for days finally broke. Cheers erupted from buildings as hidden defenders emerged. People flooded into the street, clapping each other on the back, shaking hands with the marshal and his men. Thomas stood motionless, almost unable to process the sudden resolution. Then Katherine was beside him, her eyes bright with relief and something deeper. "It's over," she said simply. Thomas nodded, still watching the distant riders, for now at least. Marshal Reeves approached, extending his hand. "Thomas Yates. Constable Davis told me about your situation. Might need a formal statement from you about Banning's operations in Colorado." "Whatever you need, Marshal," Thomas agreed, shaking the offered hand. "And thank you." "Thank your constable here," Reeves replied with a nod toward Davis. "Most thorough telegram I've received in years, had every detail I needed to justify immediate intervention." As the marshal moved away to speak with other townspeople, Katherine slipped her hand into Thomas's. "Now," she said quietly, "now we can talk about what comes next." Thomas looked down at her upturned face, at the future shining in her brown eyes, and felt the last shadows of his past finally begin to recede. "Yes," he agreed. "Now we can." 1 week later, Thomas stood on the porch of his cabin, no longer a crude shelter but a home taking shape. With help from townspeople who had insisted on showing their appreciation for his stand against Rawlins, the roof had been properly repaired, the interior walls finished, and even a small garden planted beside the creek. The creek itself had yielded modest amounts of gold, enough to be valuable, but not the mother lode Banning had apparently believed existed. Marshal Reeves had filed official reports detailing Rawlins's attempted intimidation, effectively blocking any legal maneuvers Banning might attempt from Colorado. Thomas gazed across his property, seeing not just land but possibilities. The beginnings of his small herd grazed in the southern pasture. Fields had been marked for planting come spring. And the cabin had potential beyond its current single room. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. Katherine appeared around the bend in the road, riding her bay mare with characteristic grace. She waved when she saw him watching, urging her horse to a canter for the final distance. Thomas moved to help her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps longer than strictly necessary. She didn't seem to mind, her smile warming as she looked up at him. "The lumber you ordered arrived today," she reported. "Uncle Jasper said to tell you Ferguson can bring it out tomorrow with his wagon." "Perfect timing," Thomas said, guiding her toward the porch where he'd set 2 chairs facing the spectacular view of distant mountains. "The foundation posts are all set." Katherine settled into one of the chairs, removing her bonnet and letting the late afternoon sun touch her chestnut hair. "The addition is coming along faster than I expected." "I have motivation," Thomas replied with a smile, pouring coffee from the pot he'd prepared in anticipation of her visit. These afternoon conversations had become a cherished ritual over the past week as they navigated the changing nature of their relationship. "Oh," Katherine accepted the coffee, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "And what might that be?" Instead of answering immediately, Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. Katherine's eyes widened as he knelt before her chair. "I promised to tell you everything when the shadows were gone," he said, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. "So here it is, Katherine Baker, I love you. I love your strength, your directness, your unwavering faith in people, in me, when I'd lost faith in myself." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band set with a small pearl. "This was my mother's. I've carried it with me through war and wandering, the one thing I couldn't bear to part with. Now I want it to belong to the woman who showed me what home really means." Katherine's eyes had filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Thomas Yates, are you proposing?" "I am," he took her hand gently. "I came to Montana Territory looking for a place to hide, to restart my life in isolation. Instead, I found you, and through you, a community, a purpose, a future I never thought I deserved." He drew a deep breath, holding her gaze. "Katherine Baker, will you marry me? Will you build that future with me, here on this land, in this town that's become home to us both?" Katherine set aside her coffee cup and reached out to frame his face with both hands. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." As Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, he felt the last weight of his past finally lift. In its place settled the certainty that whatever challenges came next, whether from Banning's lingering vendetta, the harsh realities of frontier life, or simply the everyday struggles of building something lasting, they would face them together. Katherine leaned forward and kissed him, a promise sealed beneath the vast Montana sky. When they separated, her brown eyes held all the love and belonging Thomas had once believed the frontier could never provide. "Welcome home, Thomas," she whispered, and in those words, he found the peace he'd been seeking since the day he'd stood at Jake's grave and promised himself a new beginning. The frontier, he realized, wasn't just a place of danger and isolation. In the right company, with the right partner, it was a place where love could not only survive but flourish, where a man could find redemption, community, and a future worth fighting for. Thomas drew Katherine into his arms, holding her close as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. He had come to restart his life and found love instead, a love that had, in turn, given him everything he truly needed to begin again.